Magic has a legend problem. Wizards of the Coast just put out an article by Eric Engelhard, where he basically is talking about how internally Wizards of the Coast has kind of been wrestling with what to do with the legendary rule. And it sounds like R&D at Wizards of the Coast is kind of split on how to handle this situation.
So get your bingo cards ready, because turns out the problem is Universes Beyond.
Ding, 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 ding,
What?
ding, 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 ding.
That's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, who would have thought?
Distraction makers.
Wizards of the Coast basically sees a problem with Universes Beyond, and it's that they want to be able to put these kind of iconic characters in every pack. Like literally the Turtles pack say a turtle in every pack, right? Because players who are coming in from outside of the Magic ecosystem and want to play Magic because of Universes Beyond, they're coming in because they want turtles, right? And then they open a pack, a booster pack, and they're like, where's the turtles?
Right.
And so now we get turtles all the way down.
Most sets, they said, have about 50 common creatures. They said the turtle set has 39 common creatures. And it's, I think, because a lot of them ended up having to be legendary, because you have to decide when organizing these sets, if something's going to be legendary, they're trying to probably reduce the amount of common legendary creatures as much as possible, but they still want to, be true to the IP, to the characters that they've been given. And even then they've had to sort of, I don't want to say, it's not cutting corners. It's like they've had to have some things on the chopping block where they've had to name some named characters as generic names in order to make sure that they aren't legendary and that they fit in with the rest of the common creatures.
Honestly, this is not the first time when the legendary rule has kind of been a point of contention for Magic the Gathering. We'll get back, we'll kind of go through the history of the legend rule in a minute, but like really the crux of this article is that the legendary rule has kind of become a catch-all for like a few too many things. The three main uses right now are that a legendary creature represents some kind of iconic character and is the character itself. The legendary rule has sort of come with this sort of flavor package of with rules implications, which is that because there's only one, there's been varying degrees of how impactful that is on the battlefield. And that also has game balance implications, which is that these cards have been balanced around the fact that you can only have one on the battlefield. Right. And then finally, the legendary rule is it can be your commander. All right, so let's go way back in time to when legendary creatures were first introduced to the game. And at that point in time, the rules for legendary were that there could only be one in play. So if whichever player got it into play first got to have it in play, and the only way for you then to play your legendary creature after that was if you removed your opponent somehow. Let's say a legendary creature was very powerful. There was a race to just whoever could get it into play first, and then that was it. The next iteration of this was that when there was a legendary creature already in play, and then another one was played, they both were destroyed. And so this was sort of the compromise with like, well, this card is no longer stuck in the player's hands, but now they can play it, and then have that sort of be the removal of the legend so that maybe then they can play their own. But this was still maintaining, I think at this point, they were still interested in maintaining the idea that like two of these things cannot exist at the same time.
Was there a time around Kamigawa era when this was finally changed that there was a certain legendary that a lot of people ended up playing? Was it Sakashima maybe was played as a removal because it would copy other people?
Yeah, so it's actually not Kamigawa. This happened with Planeswalkers. This happened with Jace the Mind Sculptor, is that they had Jace the Mind Sculptor and they had Jace Beleren, the 3-mana Jace. And people would play copies of Jace Beleren in their sideboard as a removal spell against Jace the Mind Sculptor. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
And this ultimately is what led to this rule being changed. So Kamigawa block, the Kamigawa dragons, Kakusho, Yosai, like those dragons that have death triggers.
Yeah.
The legendary rule was still in effect at that point in time where if you had two in play, they both died. And so you would play your own dragon to kill the other dragon to get double the effects, double the death effects. Kakusho being probably the most, Yosai too, but yeah, those cards were played in that way.
Okay, gotcha.
So that rule persisted, I think, all the way up until the Planeswalkers. I'm not really exactly sure on the timing when things got changed, but generally speaking, I think this is why those things got changed and around the time period in which they were changed. Okay. So after we had the sort of Jaces being used as removal against Jace the Mind Sculptor, the legend rules changed once more to say that each player can have up to one copy in play. Like at that point, you're eroding the idea of flavor, I think, like with each change, you're kind of lessening the amount of flavor impact on this rule. And so we end up in a situation where players can face off against a Jace across the battlefield or whatever, and each player can have a copy.
Which I'm sure players at that time were probably pretty upset by it sort of deteriorating some of the flavor. It's definitely a flavor fail.
Yeah, there was pushback at the time. Yeah.
But I think now in hindsight, not necessarily in hindsight, but now that there's been a whole generation of players that have just kind of been raised with that rule in mind, I feel like it makes a lot of sense. Sure. Has a lot less problems. The rule hasn't really changed since then because it's not nearly as problematic.
Well, and at that point too, right, there's some pretty severe implications for commander, right? Like if we're both playing the same commander and we can't, like you play yours and then I can't play mine, or if I play mine and it acts as a removal spell, it's a pretty big problem, right? So once you're sort of in a commander-centric world, it makes sense to change the legend rule so that, well, if we're playing the same commander, we can both have it in play, and that's fine.
Right. And it's hard to say because that's when commander, the rumblings of commander maybe would have started to grow a little bit more at that point in time, but it's hard to say if that rule was changed because of that or because of, like you were talking about Jace and that sort of interaction.
But it does seem like over time, the legend rule has kind of been eroded because of gameplay implications starting to sort of bubble up to the surface, to the point where like they can't really like work their way around the problem anymore. They kind of have to make a change that changes the implications to better fit modern design. And
so it sounds like we're kind of on the cusp of a new change coming with the legend rule. And this article is sort of showing that they are thinking about this. So maybe let's talk about what the implications are at this point, what the pressures are that are being put on the system.
Wizards of the Coast has kind of mentioned that Universes Beyond is putting pressures on the game because these iconic characters that in Magic systems should be legendary need to show up often enough that if somebody who doesn't interface with the game that often just buys like a single pack or a couple packs or something, will see these iconic characters in those packs. And we're noticing this most acutely with Ninja Turtles because the booster packs themselves say a turtle in every pack, right? And if they're making that promise, that means they're going to have to print legendaries at common. And once you do that, that now has gameplay implications, especially in limited formats. So draft and sealed, there's big implications for the fact that these legendary creatures are in the common slot, which means that you can't have multiples of them in play, especially for things like aggro. And anecdotally, I've heard that the Turtles set is pretty bad and limited, pretty weird. Most people are playing Golgari, and it's like mid-range hell and lots of removal in the format. Not enough creatures to kind of like get you over the hump.
Sure. Where in previous sets, it seems like the legend rule is used very methodically. In universe sets, it's easier for them to plan out what things and people they're including that are going to be legends. And because the legend rule can be used as an actual gameplay mechanic, as a way of balancing cards, it means that instead of being forced to attach legendary to a lot of these things, they can decide when is it going to be worthwhile? What cards do we want to have legend? And that's, I think, gives them even enough space to decide in a set that's more dedicated to standard and make sure that it's healthy and limited, that they can also think about, okay, what is this card going to be like in Commander? Because it's not an insane amount of cards for them to consider at that point.
We have also seen the sort of overabundance of legendaries creeping into the game before this, right? With Commander becoming the sort of premier format, where Wizards of the Coast, I think, was wanting players to see a lot of commanders in the sets. They're wanting to give Commander players a reason to buy packs. And what better way to do that than put a bunch of legendary creatures at rare and mythic? The place where they got themselves in trouble was that they continued to use legendary as a knob to balance cards. So they were basically saying like, well, we can go ahead and make these cards more powerful because they're legendary, because you won't be able to have more than one in play at a time. And we saw this impact happen on Standard, where there was like the Zur, the Enchanter, I think, deck showed up at the Pro Tour and ends up winning. I think Matt Nass won the Pro Tour with this Zur deck. That was just like weird. Like it was just a bunch of legends and shit, right? Like it was just the deck looked quite strange because these cards were so powerful. And then there were a bunch of legend synergies that had been printed, like Relic of Legends. I don't remember if it was in that deck or not, but there has been several decks that have basically, it felt like it was spillover from them trying to print these commander cards into the same packs that the 60 card deck formats built from.
It's hard to say if the origin point came from, well, we want to make a commander driven card and we know it's legendary, so we know it's going to be a commander, or if it's, hey, this card would be cool in standard, but let's like crank it up just a bit because it's going to be a legendary or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and again, I think this comes from the past perspective of, well, legends can be more powerful because they're legendary. So we'll come back around to that a bit when we talk about solutions, I think.
Outside of it just being like limited formats that it's affecting, is that it actually does a disservice to people that are invested in Universe Beyond sets. Because what is happening is that they're seeing a lot of some of their favorite characters be thrown into this commons or uncommons section, where a lot of those cards are forced to sort of be what, they refer to as workhorse mechanics, which is essentially just a mechanic that has to be put in place because it's needed in order for that set to function in a limited environment. And so I think one of the complaints that was on Mark's blog on Blogatog was someone was complaining about Jenica being a turtle that was popular amongst hardcore fans of TMNT, but was just kind of thrown in as a common card that doesn't really do a whole lot. And so it doesn't necessarily even fully embrace those legendary creatures as what I keep saying creatures, but they're characters, whatever. Characters in the IP that they came to go and play this game to experience.
Yeah. This to me falls under the camp, the Universe is Beyond sort of problem of like, you're not going to be able to please all of the fans of the IP, right? Which is just sort of one of these drawbacks to them leaning so heavily into Universes Beyond, is that there's always going to be those fans that are like, oh, well, my favorite character's not here. Sure. Where if we were all coming from sort of a neutral perspective with like Magic lore where it's new and all the characters are new, people can then develop their appreciation for their favorite characters rather than being like, well, where's my Jenica or whatever,
It's either you kind of have to like go all out and do every single character, or you have to just embrace that like we are going to be dipping our toe into this universe, having them sort of be like a special guest almost in the Magic universe, not, hey, this is the entire set and it's the entire universe of this. Final Fantasy, I think, was the one that caused the most upset because it's just, there's so many games with so many characters that like, there's no way they're going to fit them all in.
Especially in the case of something like Turtles. Are we going to get another Turtles set? Probably not. Look, anecdotally, but who knows? The turtle set doesn't seem to be doing very well. Basically, what this all sort of culminates in is the fact that like the legendary rule has become a problem and needs to change in some capacity, but there are different avenues that Wizards of the Coast could take to sort of try to alleviate this problem.
Wizards has on the article that Eric wrote, suggested a couple of solutions. One solution is essentially that they can start printing out common versions of these legendary creatures, but they just won't be legendary, basically. And so their idea behind this is that like commons aren't that exciting anyways as commanders, which is another flavor fail. It's like it sucks to see one of the popular turtles at a common, but it has no mechanics that are inspiring any sort of deck construction. But that way they can still fulfill their promise of you get a turtle every pack.
And I think the biggest drawback with this solution is that if you are really concerned about those more casual players if they're playing Commander or whatever, and they only get the common version of the turtle and then they can't use it as their commander, right, like that's a problem, right? Like you're sort of back at this problem of like, well, I got the card, but like, I can't build a deck around it.
Right. That feels like leaning more and more into this being a flavor fail at with the benefit of this is going to help limited. And that would help limited if they made this change. That would be them leaning towards trying to help facilitate that format, while potentially upsetting people that are invested in Universe Beyond. So
doesn't seem likely,
but more in franchise players that don't care about Commander would probably prefer that direction because they're probably not as directly tied. They probably don't care if Leonardo is or isn't, a legendary creature.
So the next path that they could choose in order to fix this problem would be to just get rid of the legendary rule. Legendary has no rules meaning anymore other than it can be your commander and then it says legendary on the card.
Yeah.
There's a big problem here though. For the last however long Legends have been in the game, they have used this as a tool to balance cards. So if you were to remove the legendary supertype, sort of remove its rules meaning, and make it so you could have as many copies in play as you want, well, guess what? You just immediately power crept the game, like across the board.
I think it's why that's just kind of a no-go. I don't think that they can do that. I think designers, I'm sure, see the implications of that, and that is a huge, huge issue. I think there was some talks in the article about like that being something they'd have to re-educate players on the new rules, and players would have to learn that, well, now you don't have to do this with legendaries. And like, I don't think that's a huge issue. Players have a harder time being re-educated if there's an altering of rules, not so much if there's a removal of a rule. It's a lot easier to tell someone like, well, legendary just doesn't do that anymore, as opposed to saying like, well, no, now your legendary doesn't kill my legendary, you know, because that suddenly means that there's a difference in tactics that you might have done, but you know, you didn't know the new rule.
Well, I could see the argument for it's difficult to like get that information out to like the wide casual player base, but like it'll get there eventually, especially if this is like a positive change for players. They're like, yes, I'm so glad that I can have 2 of these in play now or whatever.
Also, the casual player base is like, they're playing their own game anyways at this point, probably. Sure. So,
well, you're right. And that even brings up the fact that like, well, can any rules change be made then if players have like, they have no enforcement mechanism anymore, right? It used to be that Wizards could enforce these things because most like they were focused more on tournament play where they can make sure everybody has the correct rule sets, but now it's like everything's so disparate and play like every Magic play group is different that who knows.
I mean, yeah, you just kind of have to hope that your commander pod is as invested as you are and is as enfranchised as you are and following all the rules, and everyone's going to abide by that. And like we saw how that's been going with brackets, and like it's working to an extent, you know, but there's still lots of people that don't do that.
So the third option is that they could make a new super type that is similar to legendary, but doesn't have the rules baggage and also lets them keep the legendary gameplay drawback in around, so that these cards that they balance around it don't end up broken. But then this new super type then could theoretically also be your commander.
Out of the solutions that has been proposed, seems like the best option.
Yeah.
I think you even suggested that they could refer to it as like an iconic or something like that instead of legendary.
Iconic or character.
Saffron Olive maybe mentioned like Marvel Champions has like a star on some of their characters that represent that is their champion or whatever. Having a super type instead of a symbol makes a lot more sense. One, there's just not a lot of space on Magic cards at this point. There's so much stuff filling the space, and people are already looking for a super type to identify whether someone's a commander or not. And so having just a different super type that you could look at means that it's where people are already looking anyways. It's just, instead of it saying legendary, it could say iconic. And yeah, like you said, that just means that it doesn't die to the legend rule, but you could still have it as your commander, which I think is best of both worlds. It's a special middle ground that would help facilitate these limited formats, make them maybe a little bit healthier, but still would allow players to go and play, you know, the commanders of the iconic characters that they want to play.
And I think it would be important to choose a word that falls somewhere in between, like just your basic creature and legendary, right? I think iconic kind of fits in there pretty well.
Yeah.
But the only drawback I could see to this possible path is that it would not be able to be used as that sort of balancing knob that we're talking about, so that these iconic creatures, and whatever they end up calling it, they would not be as powerful as legendaries. And so why then would players use these as their commanders? If from a pure power perspective, you would probably not use these. But if it's just a gameplay and you like the characters, and we're solving that sort of casual play problem of, well, I have a limited card pool and my favorite character, I got the iconic version of it, and I can then just use it as my commander.
Right. I mean, it's going to be for bracket one people that just want, they saw Jenica the turtle. I think it's a turtle. I don't know. Turtles. Jenica, the character from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it can be used as a commander, but she is a bad card or something, right? And so if you still want your bracket one flavorful deck because you love that character, you can still do that, even if it's not actually very good.
I think for me, the biggest sort of thing that I'm getting out of this situation is that like Magic is in this really weird turbulent period where they're trying to figure out what their game even is kind of at this point. And they're not like, it feels like they're trying to like maintain everything, right? They're trying to keep 1v1 and limited involved. They're trying to, obviously Commander's there as the premier format now. Universes Beyond is being injected into that. And all of these things kind of have competing incentives and competing ideas of what they're trying to execute. And to me, it almost feels like it's making Magic like a mess of a game, which like I'm sure the designers are kind of aware of and probably why they want to change some of this stuff. But it does feel like they really need to hone in on like pick a path And like, if that path isn't the path I would want them to take, like, that's fine. I think just for the health of the game, like, you gotta like, we're commander now, and that's what we're going to sort of make decisions based on. And you can use those design pillars of commander to make better decisions rather than trying to find like a sort of halfway measure that kind of like satisfies everything, but doesn't quite fix the problem.
And I think as long as they're kind of splitting up their attention, they're going to just keep running into issues like this, whether they decide to adjust the super type and find this new in-between. That's only going to fix some of the issues that are being brought up because of this mixing of commander and standard, and mixing of universe beyond with standard sets. And so, yeah, I think as long as they're splitting their attention up, they're going to keep having issues. All of the previous sort of universe beyond sets, I don't think had nearly as many iconic characters. Something like Lord of the Rings, they were, I think, able to fill in a lot of those like generic creature types, because Lord of the Rings primarily just follows like this fellowship. Even then they still had repeated Frodo and Sam and Gollum, but
to me it's the world building, right? Because Final Fantasy and Lord of the Rings both have sort of like iconic things in the worlds, right? They have iconic creatures and iconic settings and like places, where something like Ninja Turtles or even like Spider-Man and Marvel, like, it's all the characters. Like, that's all they really get. That's iconic. And I think that puts them in this like weird position where it's hard for them to make all the different card types make sense. That's how we end up with like Pizza Lands, and how, you end up with City Pigeon and all this stuff, because like you have to fill out the rest of that world building, and it's just with like generic stuff.
I think maybe it's easier for them to throw some of those iconic characters into that generic slot. Like, do you need to remember the exact orc leader or whatever that shot Boromir with an arrow, right? Or can you just... Sure.
You talking about Lurt?
I guess. Is that his name?
Yeah.
All right. Does he need to have a card? I don't know if he has a card.
He should.
All right. What I was getting at is that Final Fantasy, I feel like was the first big set where there was lots of legendary creatures, but I think they correctly accounted for that by having legendary be something that matters in that set. They had legend matters, and I think it was part of the draft format was considering that. And I think everything after that, they just kind of knew like, well, we keep having to have these characters because that we didn't get enough in Final Fantasy. People are going to miss having this character. Let's make sure we have them in all these future things. But you can't just have legend matters in every single draft format.
You end up homogenizing everything.
So it feels like this is something that they should have accounted for earlier on and introduced this type of a rule, knowing that Universe Beyond was going to be leading into this problem.
Yeah, they should have changed. You're right. They should have changed the super type along with Universes Beyond, but maybe it's just like too much change all at once. I don't know. Something like the ring wraiths, right?
Sure.
I think that's why some of these Universes Beyond sets work better than other ones, especially because they have that world building. They have these in between thing like iconic, right? There's these iconic things, right? That like they have Mount Doom and they have the ring wraiths, and it makes sense for you to be able to have multiple ring wraiths in play, so they don't have to be legendary, but they're still iconic and people still recognize them. And so I think when you get into these IPs that are just a little too shallow, right? They're homogenized around like a very specific few characters. You end up in this weird tons of legends territory.
It's like Final Fantasy still obviously had legend matters, but Final Fantasy's been around enough that enough games have created generic monsters.
You have like
there's
chocobos
and there's Moogles,
cactars, and there's all. And honestly, maybe it's the fact like it's the bad guys. Maybe the bad guys. Like when I think about turtles, like there's basically like the sort of generic foot soldiers, and there's like the little robot guys or whatever that have, they just have like a clampy mouth or whatever. And then they have like Shredder and Krang. And it's like, that's it. That's like, they don't have that, like the in-between's not there.
They have a lot of other villains, but those villains are all named villains, right? Because it's the comic book style, right? Yeah. Where you're not going to have a bunch of generic things. You have to have someone that you have to root against or whatever. That person's named and has a story and all that. So
I wonder, whatever, we're starting to speculate at this point, but I do wonder if maybe comic book storytelling specifically is subject to this problem. Like I do wonder if it has something to do with the economy of storytelling, right? And the fact that like you have the sort of limited space and you have the, only like, I don't know, 15, 16 pages or whatever a single comic book issue is. And you have to like hammer these points home pretty quickly. It's kind of that sort of pulp storytelling where like the world building isn't necessarily as like fleshed out like it would be in something like Lord of the Rings is, I mean, it's incredible. Like what Tolkien did with the world. Like he basically invented an entire world and then wrote books in that world, right? Where like, a comic book side of things, not to say that all comics work this way, but I think generally speaking, the sort of incentives about the things that you need to create for a comic book to work, you don't need to create a whole world. You create iconic characters and iconic villains, and that's how you make your stories.
Right. We could even look at Last Airbender as a good example of this, that there wasn't a guarantee of like, you are going to get one of the 4 adventurers from The Last Airbender in every pack. It was as long as you got someone that was an airbender or a waterbender or a firebender or whatever, and that's something that is much more just naturally integrated into the world and story as opposed to only dedicated to specific iconic characters.
I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how Marvel superheroes turns out. I don't know.
You sound impressed. You sound excited.
I don't like any of the Universe Beyond stuff generally, but obviously some of it works better than others. Like Lord of the Rings, I'm like, yeah, that's actually fine.
And we'll see how The Hobbit goes.
We'll see.
If you enjoy listening to us talk about the Legend Rule, feel free to give us a like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you think this episode was legendary, you can join our Discord. Links in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye. You're legendary. You're legendary.
Yep.
You're legendary.
No NPCs in this chat.
You're legendary.
Thank you.